Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. Thank you all for coming. My name is Yeshua Moser Pungsuan, and I am a member of the FCCT and also an editor and research coordinator for the Landmine and Cluster Munition Monitor, about which we're going to hear today. We will have a small introduction to our report by Shushira Chuncha. And then we will hear from a person who's had a close experience with a landmine from Sakau province. And then we will hear from our panel today. So Shushira, would you please come up?
Good morning. My name is Shushira Chontenchop. I'm the program manager of the Norwegian People's Aid in Thailand. I'm also the long-time campaigner working closely with the international campaign to ban landmines and cluster munitions, or ICBL CMC. Norwegian People's Aid is also a member of ICBL CMC and have a long enjoyed their cooperation with the campaign, working side by side for the humanitarian disarmament activities, including the research and advocacy. I am delighted to have opportunity today to introduce the 26th edition of the Landmine Monitor. The Landmine Monitor is a pioneering civil society monitoring mechanism started in 1998 to provide regular, comprehensive reporting of all aspects of the landmines ban, with the focus on the universalization and implementation of the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty. More generally, the monitor assesses the international community response of the humanitarian problems caused by landmine, cluster munitions, and other explosive remnants of war. The 2024 Landmine Monitor Report provides a global overview of the development relating to the landmine ban policy, the use, production, transfer, stockpiling, stockpile destruction in 2023 and 2024. The report also contains the latest information on landmine contamination and casualty, as well as the effort to reduce that impact via clearance, survey, risk education, and victim assistance. Landmine Monitor 2024 documents recent use of the anti-personnel mines by Myanmar and Russia, as well as by Iran and North Korea. And while the report finds more land was clear in 2023 compared to those of previous years, no state complete the clearing all mine areas on their territory last year. The number of the record casualties of mine and ERW record in 2023 unfortunately increased by more than 1,000 compared with the previous year. The impact on civilians remains high, especially in countries where mines were recently used. The total number of the mine victims in the world continue to increase each year, but services and resources for the assistance are not able to expand adequately to meet their needs. Today's launch is just a few days prior to the Mine Ban Treaty 5th Review Conference, which will take place next week in Siem Reap, Cambodia, one of the most mine-affected countries in the world. The monitor data will feed into one of the review conference objectives, which are to review the progress and challenge over the last few years, or the last 5 years. State parties are also expected to adopt the political declaration that will demonstrate their renewed commitment to the ban, and the action plan set out a series of steps they commit to take simulate more expedient implementation of the treaty's legal obligations. Before beginning, I would like to recognize the member of our monitoring and research committee who oversee the quality of the report alongside with our expert, editing and the production team, the Colombian to ban landmines, the Colombian campaign to ban landmines, Danish Church Aid, Danish Refugee Council, Humanity and Inclusion, Human Rights Watch, and the My Action Canada. We also deeply grateful to our donors, Austria, Canada, France, Germany, the Holy See, Luxembourg, Norway, Switzerland, and the United States.
Thank you, Shushira. Landmines are a human problem, and your experience of it will depend on who you are and where you live. And in Southeast Asia, that means if you live in border areas, most likely you are affected by the landmine problem. I would like to invite Wibunrat Chunchu to come up from Sakao province of Thailand and talk about her experience as a landmine victim in this country.
Hey, I'm Cherry Helgesen and I work for Norwegian People's Aid in Thailand and I will be translating for Kun Viburat ค่ะ
สวัสดีค่ะดิฉันนางวิบุลรัตน์จันชูเป็นเหยื่อผู้ประสบภัยจากทุ่นระเบิดอำเภออรัญญประเทศจังหวัดสระแก้วนะคะฉันเหยียบขณะไปตัดไม้ไผ่ชายแดนไทยกัมพูชาเมื่อปีพ.ศ. 1966 ค่ะ
Hello, my name is Vinburat Chanchu. I'm a landmine survivor from Aranjapratet district, Sakeo province. In 1966, I stepped on a landmine while cutting bamboo in the border forest.
เป็นเวลามากกว่า20ปีนับตั้งแต่ประเทศไทยเป็นรัฐภาคีอนุสัญญาห้ามทุ่นระเบิดสังหารบุคคลสิ่งต่างๆเปลี่ยนไปมากสถานการณ์ปัจจุบันเป็นดังนี้ค่ะ
It has been more than 20 years since Thailand became the state party of the Landmine Treaty, and since then, things have changed. Situations as of today include
ยังมีทุ่นระเบิดหลงเหลือในพื้นที่แถวบ้านดิฉันค่ะจังหวัดสระแก้วค่ะ
There are still landmines and other explosive remnants of war remaining in the area where I live.
หน่วยงาน NGO เคยช่วยเหลือผู้ประสบภัยมีน้อยมากไม่มี handicap international JRS coer แล้วฉันคิดว่าเพราะรัฐบาลไทยสามารถดูแลบริการที่เคยเป็นช่องว่างได้มากขึ้นเรื่อยๆค่ะ
The number of NGOs that used to assist victims has significantly decreased. Organizations like Handicap International, GRS, and COERR are no longer present. I think this is because the Thai government is now better able to provide those services and fill those gaps themselves.
รัฐบาลไทยให้ความช่วยเหลือดีเยี่ยมมากเรื่องเหตุฉุกเฉินการส่งต่อและให้การดูแลเจ็บไข้ได้ป่วยโดยไม่ต้องเสียเงินถ้ามีบัตรคนพิการเขาจะแยกกลุ่มเลยค่ะและได้รับบริการรวดเร็วขึ้นค่ะ
The Thai government provides very good emergency, referral, and healthcare services free of charge. If you have a disability card, you are prioritized and now receive faster services as well.
สำหรับอาชีพกองทุนกู้ยืมสามารถกู้ได้ไม่เสียดอกเบี้ยค่ะคล่องตัวดีขึ้นมากเยี่ยมมากค่ะของประเทศไทยค่ะ
Interest-free loans are now available for people with disabilities, making it easier to support our livelihoods and career growth.
ทุกคนได้รับขาเทียมแต่บริการยังจำกัดผู้พิการบางคนอาจมาจากที่อื่นมาที่ศูนย์ขาเทียมอรัญญประเทศก็ไม่ได้ขาเทียมกลับไปบางทีก็ต้องรอและงบประมาณของโรงพยาบาลมีจำกัดและไม่ได้นัดล่วงหน้าช่วงทำขาเทียมไม่ทันจำกัดคืน5 ปี 6 ปีการเบอร์โทรของช่างขาเทียมไม่มีผู้พิการก็เลยไม่มีเบอร์โทรมาแล้วไม่ได้ขาเทียมกลับบ้านค่ะ
Everyone can get prosthetic legs, but the services are limited. Some people with disabilities travel from other areas without an appointment to the prosthetic center in Aranja Pratet, but don't always receive one right away. Sometimes they have to wait as the hospital's budget is limited.
ในการไทยยังมีจำกัดในการล่ามภาษามือหรือสถานที่บริการการใช้ภาษามือการบริการทางการมองไม่เห็นในสถานที่ราชการตอนนี้ผู้พิการจะกับระเบิดของเรายังไม่มีล่ามภาษามือค่ะ
There are no sign language interpreters available, and also there are no one to help them if they need services for the blind.
ผู้พิการขณะนี้เริ่มมีอายุมากขึ้นบางคน80-90ดิฉันอายุ57 ปีค่ะมันเปลี่ยนสิ่งที่สำคัญเปลี่ยนจากจะทำยังไงให้คนพิการประกอบอาชีพหาเงินได้ดีเป็นประจำจะทำยังไงให้คนพิการได้รับการดูแลที่บ้านจากครอบครัวและชุมชนเมื่อกลายเป็นผู้ป่วยติดเตียงค่ะ
Many people with disabilities are now aging, with some reaching 80 to 90 years old. I'm 57 and things have changed. The focus has shifted from helping people with disabilities earn a living to ensuring they receive proper care at home from their families and communities as they become bedridden.
เป็นผู้ป่วยติดเตียงที่สำคัญผ้าอ้อมเป็นสิ่งสำคัญมากค่ะคนดูแลผู้ป่วยเป็นคนสำคัญเขาควรจะสามารถดูแลผู้ป่วยได้แต่อาจประกอบอาชีพเล็กๆน้อยๆทำอะไรที่บ้านได้พร้อมๆกันเพื่อให้มีรายได้มากขึ้นและเราควรจะทำอย่างไรดีให้เขาได้เครียดน้อยลงทั้งผู้ป่วยและก็ผู้ดูแลด้วยค่ะขอบคุณค่ะ
Since we don't have access to official caregivers, many of us rely on friends and family for full-time care. This often prevents caregivers from working and earning an income. We need to find ways to support them and reduce their stress. Additionally, for people that are bedridden and have to stay in bed all the time, diapers are also needed as they are quite expensive to buy. Thank you.
Thank you, Wibun Rat, for bringing the human face, because the rest of our presentation today is going to be pretty data heavy. I would like to draw your attention to these sheets that we have in the back, which are the stories of human beings who have been affected by landmines in one way or another. This is Shrey Nang's story that you have in the back. She is also on the cover of our report this year, and she will also be at the 5th Review Conference. I'd like to now invite our panelists to come up and get seated at the panel. In 1997, when the international campaign to ban landmines received our Nobel Peace Prize, it came in two parts. One part was to our co-laureate panelists. Please take your seats. One part was to our campaign as a whole. The other was to our director at that time, Jody Williams. Jody Williams was to join us online today. She has had a health crisis, and we are very concerned about her. She will not be joining us online. She will not attend the Fifth Review Conference this year. However, our current director, who does represent our movement as a Nobel Peace Laureate in different places, is available for interview. She's sitting at the table right here, Tamar Gabelnick, who's our current director. We have on the panel today Mark Hisney, from the ban policy section of our report, who will talk on universalization, use, stockpile destruction, production, and so forth. We have Lauren Percy, who will talk about the human impact, casualties, victim assistance. We have Katrin Atkins, who will be talking about the remediation of impact through clearance and other mine action activities. And finally, Ruth Bottomley, who will be talking about what type of support there is for mine action on the planet today. And I think you're going to go in that order, so I'll let you hand off to one another as you proceed. And after this, we will have question and answers.
Thank you, Yeshua. I guess that means we're ready to go. First slide, please. Hello. First, I will be addressing universality of the treaty. There are 164 states parties to this convention with one signatory. There are 33 countries that are outside the convention, including Russia, China, the US, et cetera, et cetera. We have not added new states parties since December of 2017, so it's been quite a long time. And those most recent, if you could call it that, states of the state of Palestine and Sri Lanka. Universality is a major push here after 25 years. And the progress has generally been thought up to this time that the number of mines going into the ground was less than the number of mines being removed from the ground. I hope I got that right. And that's not a good trend. And I think you see that reflected in states' behavior and the response to the landmine issue. Next, we're going to talk about the use of the weapon in the past year. And our reporting period for this section of the report is from mid-October 2023 to mid-October, October 2024 approximately. We have documented new use in 4 countries. All 4 of these countries are outside of the treaty. We kind of avoided alphabetical order here because of the nature of the mine use. Myanmar, who has been using anti-personnel mines since 1999 when we started this. We've listed them every year, but their numbers have increased. That's a reflection of a change, and it is borne out in the indicators of casualties and affected territory. The next country in this list that I've constructed is Russia, which has been using anti-personnel mines in Ukraine since the very beginning of the war in early 2022. The other 2 countries, the nature of the mine use we have documented is of a different character. It's much smaller, more episodic, and it does not appear to be as severe. And both involve countries mining particular parts of their borders to prevent smuggling, all kinds of excuses that they could come up with. And that is North Korea, which mined its border with parts of its border that were open with South Korea, and they've also mined their border in certain areas with China. And the other country is Iran. This country's been on our radar screen for a few years, but we were not able to document it properly. We were able to do that this year to say that there are new casualties being caused by new mines being placed in the ground, both on the border with Afghanistan and the border with Iraq. Non-state armed groups, they also use anti-personnel mines, and we documented 5 countries this cycle: Colombia, India, Myanmar again, Pakistan, and in Palestine. The next list there, when we address the Sahel region, this is a part of the Lake Chad Basin of Africa, but these are situations where we have 1 or 2 victim-activated landmine incidents a year. So it's hard to see the trend. But we do report on new use in countries like Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, DR Congo, Mali, Niger, and Nigeria. Again, these are episodic reports that we receive and we're able to confirm, but we're not related to, again, of a different character of mine use. We're not talking tens of thousands of mines placed on the border. We're talking 1 or 2 mines a year that are found or create victims. Next slide, please. Thank you. Stockpile destruction. One of the main obligations of this treaty is to destroy the stockpiles that are possessed by a country within a certain amount of time. That deadline is extendable in this case of this treaty. States parties to this treaty have so far destroyed over 55 million stockpiled anti-personnel mines. These are mines that never leave the warehouse except to go be blown up in a field. And it starts to work on that balance between creating fewer mines going in the ground. And it's much, much less expensive to destroy a mine from stockpile than it is to survey and clear them in a demining process. We have 2 states parties that have still yet to finish the job and have gone beyond their deadline by many years. And those are Greece, which has about 335,000 mines to go, and they have recently concluded an agreement with Croatia to destroy the rest of the stockpile. We're hoping they come to Siem Reap with a deadline certain when they're going to, if they're there and the deadline's already done, that would be really good news. And the other country is Ukraine, which inherited a very large stockpile from the breakup of the Soviet Union. There are over 3.3 million landmines or anti-personnel mines left. This is one particular system called the PFM or butterfly mine that are very expensive to destroy because of a novel explosive used in it, requires environmental remediation and containment. Plus their countries being invaded in the storage areas where the mines have been subject to missile and bomb attacks, as the Ukrainians say. So those are 2 countries that we need to get off this list. Out of the 164 states parties existing, 94 of those had stockpiles at one time. So that is quite an impressive achievement, and it demonstrates that you don't necessarily need Russia, China, and the US to lead the way. Getting the mines out of the hands of the users or possible users, again, works on that equation of more mines being pulled from the ground than going into the ground. Next slide. Production, we have a dirty dozen countries listed there. I'll read them out. Armenia, China, Cuba, India, Iran, Myanmar, North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, Singapore, South Korea, and Vietnam are all countries that either have once produced mines or are continuing currently to produce mines or develop mines. And we think that applies to India, Iran, Myanmar, Pakistan, Russia, and South Korea, which was a new twist to us this year. Both India and South Korea are procuring the components necessary to assemble anti-personnel landmines and deliver them by rocket and artillery, and looking at introduction in the early 2030s. So these are countries we'd like to get off this list. The newest country on this list is Armenia, who it turned out started making mines before it was in a war with Azerbaijan. And I think I have one more slide to go. No, I don't. Happy to answer questions later on. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I'll take it from here and talk about the situation of casualties from landmines and other explosive remnants of war, and also say or add a little bit about the global situation for assistance to the victims of landmines before handing over to my colleague Katrin to talk about other impacts. So just to mention casualties, the casualty situation as we record it is for the previous calendar year. That's how we're able to gather the information in a way that's consistent over time. And quite clearly in 2023, the country with the most casualties in the world for the first time was Myanmar. For the 3 years prior to that, the country with the most casualties had been Syria, and before that, for many years, Afghanistan. So this is a real and notable change. There was globally an increase in casualties by about 1,000 casualties from some 4,700 to 5,700 over the annual period. That wasn't all because of Myanmar. There were still many casualties in Syria, which had the second highest number, and also casualties in Ukraine and continuing casualties in Afghanistan. But very much a changing global situation, in part, not only because of the massive increase of use in Myanmar and this kind of catastrophic difference in the number of casualties, even though casualties had been recorded in Myanmar in very high numbers for all the over 20 years of the reporting. But because of the situation in Afghanistan, Mark had mentioned improvised explosive devices. Now they had been used very prevalently in Afghanistan for many years under the Taliban. The change of the political situation there means that there's actually many more casualties from explosive remnants of war, from now that mines, these improvised explosive devices that are improvised mines are not being planted. Most of the casualties seem to be from children collecting scraps and interacting with other explosives, and a different kind of tragic situation there. So there was casualties in 55 countries and areas, including the 38 states parties, mostly in parties to the Mine Ban Treaty. That continues, but go to the next slide, thanks. As always, and this is universally the case, the majority of casualties by far were civilians. And a significant proportion of civilian casualties were children. It very much is in some countries where the number of child casualties, like Afghanistan, it actually is greater than adult casualties. And these improvised landmines continue to cause actually the most casualties, because what we see has happened is the success of the Mine Ban Treaty has meant that, in general, less manufactured anti-personnel mines are used and more are cleared from the ground. So there's less casualties of these traditional kind of built anti-personnel mines. And yet there are armed groups producing massive amounts of improvised mines, some of them with huge levels of explosives, but very sensitive triggers and fusing that could still be set off by an individual, even a child. And what we saw, though, in 2023 was a change that actually the number of manufactured anti-personnel mines causing casualties increased, and that was particularly in Myanmar, in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, also a tripling of the number of anti-vehicle mine casualties, where mines that were designed to go against tanks are blowing up tractors in fields where people are just trying to get by and make a living. As Ms. Wiwunrat Chanchu had mentioned, you know, in the case of her accident, and as is mostly the case, it's people doing their everyday activities to survive, collecting things or working in the fields or grazing sheep, who are most likely to come in touch with explosives, or children playing or collecting scrap. I think that's the situation on casualties in a nutshell, but also, like Mark, happy to answer questions. And I'd just say briefly on the situation of assisting the victims. We have really a situation in the world where there's ever increasing casualties, particularly because of new conflicts and improvised mines. And in those countries, the impact of the conflict itself is also degrading the health and rehabilitation systems where people most need care. And that is very much the case still in Afghanistan, also in places like Yemen and Ukraine. And then there's the other situation, the situation that Ms. Wiwunrat was talking about, where it maybe is a long time ago that the mines were used, and where the governments have maybe started to build a system where things are getting better. There is rehabilitation, where maybe the NGOs, like here, and like as the case in Sakau and Aranya Pratet, start to move away, and the government starts to fill that gap. But generally in the world, that isn't happening as fast as here in Thailand. And generally it's not happening fast enough. And what's really concerning is often the resources that come from international organizations are actually starting to go down so fast that there's no way that the state system could fill the gap. And in 2023, we saw about 6 countries where programs were cut completely because funding was gone. But that didn't mean that the health systems that the governments had come to replace it. And those situations, as I mentioned, are even worse in countries with conflict, or countries where there are massive crises, and the economic situation is also preventing that, like Afghanistan. So in that case, I think as Ms. Wiwunrat mentioned, the support of survivors' own networks is essential to delivering everyday services. And one of the problems is previously there was actually more funding for such support, and that has gone down as well. That's something we really need to keep an eye on. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the contamination worldwide, followed by the clearance of landmines in 2023 and risk education that has been implemented. So sadly, last year we had no new state party that reported completing clearance of anti-personnel mines. This means that since the treaty entered into force in 1999, a total of 30 states have completed clearance of anti-personnel mines so far. The last ones to do so were Chile and the United Kingdom in 2020 with the clearance of the mines on the Falkland Islands. Today we have at least 58 states and other areas, including 33 state parties that are contaminated with anti-personnel mines. When I talk about other areas, this includes Kosovo, Somaliland, and the Western Sahara. We also used to have Nagorno-Karabakh on that list, but Nagorno-Karabakh ceased to exist early 2024. It's now reported under the territory of Azerbaijan, which is contaminated with anti-personnel mines as well. These states also include 32 states, including 25 state parties, which are believed or known to be contaminated with improvised mines. And just to explain a bit more about improvised mines, so when we talk about improvised mines, we talk about victim-activated improvised explosive devices that are detonated by the presence, proximity, or contact of a person. The 25 state parties known or believed to be affected by improvised mines amount to 15 more state parties than in 2019. The highest increase of use of improvised mines since the last review conference is on the continent of Africa, as already mentioned by Mark. We had last year, with their Article 7 report for 2023, Burkina Faso and Mali for the first time acknowledging the presence of mines of an improvised nature on their territory. To give another a bit of a background explanation, we heard about the casualties, we heard about all these countries having casualties, and usually there's a bit of a delay in reporting contamination. So we first see the casualties as a first impact, but then later on contamination is confirmed, and luckily Burkina Faso and Mali have now confirmed the contamination, and hopefully other countries with improvised mine contamination will follow. Currently 9 other states should confirm that they have improvised mine contamination or give us more clarity. This includes Benin, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Mexico, Mozambique, the Philippines, Togo, Tunisia, and Venezuela. The state parties with currently a massive contamination, so massive means over 100 square kilometers of anti-personnel mine contamination, include Afghanistan, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Cambodia, Ethiopia, Iraq, Turkey, and Ukraine. We have to say that for Ukraine and Ethiopia, we just have a very rough estimate. Survey hasn't taken place yet or is not finalized yet, so this is likely to be changed or hopefully be confirmed in the near future that we know more about the contamination in these 2 countries. It is certainly of particular interest that Cambodia still has over 430 square kilometers left. It's certainly something that will also be discussed next week, and around 80% of this contamination is in the border area along the border with Thailand. To have a look at Thailand, Thailand has around 22 square kilometers left, and also this contamination is along the border with Cambodia. Next slide, please. So for 2023, state parties reported a total clearance of a bit over 280 square kilometers, and the destruction of more than 160,000 anti-personnel mines. As you can see in the brackets, this is an increase of the cleared area to last year. It's a slight decrease of the destroyed anti-personnel mines compared with 2022. It also can be said that this is the largest area cleared since the last review conference in 2019. So that's a positive note we can make. Cambodia and Croatia are the countries that cleared the most land last year, over 200 square kilometers approximately. And they destroyed almost 25,000 anti-personnel mines. However, what we have to say is that clearance progress has been less promising in 11 other states, including Thailand, who cleared less than 1 square kilometers. Also, some countries, namely Eritrea, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Oman, and Sudan, did not report on clearance at all. What has to be mentioned here of these countries who did not clear more than 1 square kilometers, we still have to acknowledge that they released land through other methods. They released land through technical survey and non-technical survey. Taking Thailand as an example again, not clearing more than 1 square kilometer, but releasing over 8 square kilometers of land through technical survey and non-technical survey. So globally, when we look at all land release methodologies, including technical, non-technical survey and clearance, all state parties released almost 700 square kilometers of land. Another point I would like to mention is that in 2023 and 2024, 9 state parties requested extensions to their current deadlines. Eritrea and Ukraine in 2023. Both requests were granted. And this year, Afghanistan, Chad, Cyprus, Guinea-Bissau, Niger, Peru, and Serbia. These extension requests will be discussed and considered next week. Unfortunately, we have to say that we expect more extension requests to come in. We have a lot of countries with clearance deadlines by 2025, and currently it looks that only Oman is on track to finish on time. Next slide, please. Provision of risk education, equally important as clearance. Clearance is a slow process, so as long as contamination is there, we need to make sure that at least the communities are warned and know how to deal with the risk. Of the 23 states parties with clearance obligations, 28, so quite a high percentage, reported having implemented risk activities in 2023. The states parties with the most beneficiaries reached were Afghanistan, followed by Ukraine, South Sudan, Yemen, and Cambodia. Unfortunately, only 14 of these 28 countries provided disaggregated beneficiary data and sufficient details about risk education activities in their Article 7 report. It is something we have observed during the last few years, that risk education still has not the same importance as clearance, even in the reporting. And we try to change this and to improve it. In addition to these states parties, it is also known that Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Mali, and the Philippines, again, all countries believed or known to be contaminated by improvised mines, implemented risk education as well, focusing on improvised mines. Going back to the reporting, another point that has to be mentioned is that countries that request for an extension, unfortunately, rarely properly plan and budget risk education in their extension requests. If we look at the 9 requests received in the last 2 years, only Guinea-Bissau and Serbia provided a detailed and budgeted plan to implement risk education during the extension period. Talking a bit more about the beneficiaries, so children remained a key target group also in 2023, with 67% of all beneficiaries reached. Children have already been a priority in previous years, but this year we really see an increase in the percentage of reached children. In 2022, only 47% of all beneficiaries were children, and this year, the 67%. And that's it from my end. Ruth?
Thanks, Katrin. So I'm going to talk about mine action funding. So this applies to landmines, but also cluster munitions, clearance of cluster munitions, and ERW, and it relates to both international donations, but also those provided by affected states themselves towards their own mine action programs. So in 2023, we saw that global funding for mine action surpassed 1 billion, which is the first time we've kind of reached the billion mark. And this includes both international and national funding. We identified 35 international donors who provided a similar level to last year, around 798 million. And the sort of donors remain largely the same. The 15 largest donors provided about 96% of all the funding, and the 3 largest donors are the US, followed by Germany and the European Union. We also identified this year 20 affected states which provided funds for their own mine action programs. And this includes a contribution by Azerbaijan that was reported for clearance in territories regained after the conflict with Armenia in 2020. But funding by affected state parties is very poorly reported. They're supposed to report every year in their Article 7 reports, but it's quite sketchy, so it's very difficult to show clear trends in national funding. Just as of note, since the last review conference in Oslo, total support for mine action has amounted to about 3.9 billion. And state parties to the Mine Ban Treaty have been very consistent in their provision of financial assistance. So they provided around 49% of this combined contribution. Funding for Ukraine increased significantly in 2023. Ukraine received 308 million, which is 39% of all international donor funds. And it's almost double the amount that went to Ukraine in 2022. Maybe because of this kind of shift of funding towards Ukraine, we've also seen a decrease in funding in other countries, other affected countries. Probably of particular concern is Afghanistan, which saw a decrease of 40 million in its funding from 2022. And this is despite having quite a strong national mine action coordination structure and national capacity. But it struggled to attract funding since the Taliban returned to power in 2021. So state parties with smaller contamination continue to receive less financial support. This has been a trend that we've observed for several years. Of the 12 state parties that have less than 5 kilometres square of contamination, only 6 received funding for clearance in 2023, and that was Colombia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Palestine, Senegal, Serbia, and Somalia. And 8 state parties with Article 5 clearance obligations did not receive any international funding, despite 4 of them requesting funding. So that's Guinea-Bissau, Niger, Peru, and Turkey. So there's a recognition that the inability of some state parties to meet their Article 5 clearance obligations is because they have been unable to attract international funds. So we're hoping that next week at the review conference, this will be something that will be discussed, as it's been recognized as a problem by state parties. And there is currently an action within the draft Siem Reap Angkor action plan that we hope will start to address this through a trust fund. The majority of funding in 2023 was spent on clearance, so around 50% of the total contribution. The funding support for victim assistance still remained within a range of 5 to 8%, which we've observed for the last 5 years. And so 59% of victim assistance funds in 2023 went to just 5 states: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen. So many state parties who have significant numbers of mine ERW survivors did not get any earmark support, despite the sort of needs remaining great. And sort of most of the international funding, where it was disaggregated, goes to international non-profit organizations. They got around 37% of total contributions. National government agencies also received more in 2023, but the large proportion of those funds went to the national demining agencies in Ukraine. National non-profit organizations still receive very little funding, or very little recorded funding, so less than 1% of all funds. So that's it. Happy to ask any questions, and I'll hand back to Yeshua.
Thank you all for that global summary. That was a lot of data. So I will summarize the entire report in 4 sentences. Funding up, good. Clearance up, good. Casualties up, bad. More nations with mines being used, bad. So now the data that's important to you we will get by questions. This is a hybrid event, so we are monitoring what's coming in on Zoom. I'm also monitoring what's coming in on Facebook Live, but we have a microphone there in the back, and you can go there and ask your questions. Please identify yourself by your organization before your question. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, Benjamin Zawacki with the Asia Foundation, and special shout out to Lauren, who I've known for a long time. Question for any of the panelists. Good news that mines, more mines coming out of the ground than are going in, but more mines, more victims, you said, are sort of on the uptick. I mean, the question I would have is, to what extent are you confident that the positive trends are only the result of fewer conflicts? In other words, if a bunch of the countries who are states party to the treaties are only worth the paper they're written on, we see them violated all the time, were suddenly found themselves in wars they didn't expect, to what extent do you think this is an ideological commitment on the part of those countries to say these things disproportionately affect children, they violate a whole host of other, moral and ethical norms, et cetera, and we won't deploy these sorts of munitions? And to what extent is this just part of the sort of extended Pax Americana, who was, of course, sort of rudely broken by a number of wars in recent years? And if the world sort of found itself with the same level of conflicts that, say, were present in the 70s and 80s, would we see a return to that situation? Or do you think that countries would actually adhere to the, because we do see lots and lots of advocates for example, cluster munitions in Ukraine, people saying, look, I hate to advocate this, but it would work. It would actually, it would actually be to Ukraine's benefit in, keeping Russian soldiers off of parts of the land. I mean, there's the sort of utilitarian argument in favor, which often comes to the fore in war. So, sorry, a convoluted question, but it gets to the sort of heart of these positive trends. Thank you.
Who'd like to take that?
Why don't you go ahead, Lauren?
Yeah, look, I'll start. I think, there's a lot that Mark could say from the band perspective about this as well, because clearly these things are interlinked. But, I mean, it's my sense from the casualty reporting, so from what we actually see in the world, that, I mean, and I'll tell you, states are really not using mines. States parties are not using mines, and they've destroyed them. I mean, they're basically gone. And I think the antipersonnel landmine is a thing of the past. Unfortunately, that past is kind of lingering with us. And it's especially with us in terms of these improvised devices, which non-state armed groups are often using in conflicts, but not always. And it's true that there can be trends, and that these things are very adaptive, and especially these non-state groups, it depends on what they can get, where they can use it, what they think works, what message it's going to send. But my sense is from the casualty data that even where there are conflicts, states are not leaping at some opportunity to use this kind of obsolete and indiscriminate weapon. And I think it's there may be political reasons either way that could be considered, but the fact is that it's pretty set now. Anti-personnel landmines are just causing basically civilian casualties, and they are for years afterwards. And it's not just something we say; it's something we can measure. We can see that. We can see that this happens over decades, and it happens a long time, even when the devices are what would otherwise be called non-persistent, right? So like these improvised mines, they're normally battery powered. They run out. And there were some arguments years ago that there's like, maybe the next thing in landmines would be have non-persistent mines. Okay, there'll be more humanitarian, you could use them, but they'll switch off. But they do. Taliban mines will eventually switch off. Mines in the Sahel will eventually switch off because they have batteries, and they're still causing thousands of casualties. And I don't think this is something that states really would be turning to from any indication of the reality of conflict as we see it. But that's just my sense. Mark, do you want to say something about that and stuff?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a leap off the cliff here. Back in the mid-90s and times before that, the voices from the field really started to begin a process that went outside typical arms control, worry about getting the major powers aboard, et cetera, et cetera. This kind of shifted things. The focus was on the victims, and reducing the number of victims is the only way of solving this crisis and this, intergenerational contamination that renders land and livelihood a threat. When people ask me why from the U.S. don't you care more about landmines, I don't cross a minefield to go to the 7-Eleven. I don't have to take sheep out to graze. I don't need to gather firewood, so it has a very different meaning than to the affected states that are living with this intractable legacy without the political and humanitarian will to address it. And that was the whole concept of the Mine Ban Treaty, was not worry about the US-China, worry about the Afghanistan's, Angolas, and the Cambodia, and all the, what was the number of affected states at the beginning of all this? It's in the 60s?
Around 100.
Around 100. You have countries addressing this problem. Now, we run into this argument from the security side of things about how ineffectual it is. I did try to point out that 94 of these 164 countries had landmines. This isn't just St. Kitts and Nevis and Jamaica banning a weapon they don't have. This is 94 states making a commitment to destroy the stockpiles, to assist the victims, and to clear the mines. And it also influenced the behavior of the great powers. Again, I hate using the U.S. as an example these days, but they haven't used They haven't used mines since 1991, haven't transferred them since 1992, haven't produced them since 1997. I mean, that doesn't add much to the criticality of deploying new mines as some kind of wonder weapon that is going to solve all the problems. It does create, though, a very cynical, what I view as cynical response, that if country X uses mines, we'll just spend $100 million later to clean it up, and all things will be, solved. We will promise not to use mines in densely populated areas. I guess the people in the agricultural fields and the lightly populated areas are just out of luck. So that, to me, is very cynical. So, I mean, there's the ick factor, the stigma of the use. I need to be regenerated by it to come and be in the field, not in Geneva. I don't know if that ramble addressed really your answer, but the humanitarian disarmament field, if you will, where the humanitarian concerns become paramount over security, we view as a positive trend. And unfortunately, this year, the indicators are starting to point in a direction that's very disturbing.
Okay, nods that it did respond to the question. Next question, please.
Hello, my name is Ross Adkin from AFP News Agency. Thanks for the presentation. I have three short questions on Myanmar. The first, the figure for the 2023 casualties of 1,003, how likely is it that this is an underestimate due to the very difficult conditions on the ground there and getting reliable information out? The second, do you or does anyone have an estimate of how many mines are in the ground in Myanmar, or how many square kilometers of territory are contaminated? Not just since the 2021 coup, but we all know there was plenty of fighting going on before that. And the third, in the 2023 casualty figures you give, do you have a concrete breakdown of casualties from anti-personnel landmines, from remnants of war, and from IEDs? As we've seen a lot of the sort of newer anti-junta groups, IEDs is one of the main weapons in their arsenal. I was wondering if you'd managed to come to any conclusions about a breakdown along those lines. Thank you.
Shall I take that? Yes, I see all my colleagues looking at me. Okay, let me see. Your first one was on the total number of casualties, yes. No, that is nowhere close to the total number of casualties. There's no armed group in Myanmar, not the military, not any of the ethnic armed groups, not the PDFs, that provide us with any data on the number of casualties they have within their group. And we know from anecdotal evidence that it's massive. The number that we report there is what we can report. We can say at least this many. How many more? Double? Sure. Triple? Quite possibly. So it's what we can count. There's no medical surveillance system in the country that can provide official data in any manner or form. So that's what that figure is. Your second one on the level of contamination, generally the monitor does not look at the number of mines in the ground. That's a speculative figure. Once you clear an area, you'll know how many were in there. And it's more what is causing the most human casualties in a country, and how can you define that area and clear it. There is no ability to do survey in Myanmar today. What we can tell you is at least 190 townships have registered some level of contamination. Now, how extensive is that in that township differs from township to township, and we really have no clue. And what was your last question?
If, I guess maybe not, if the data is very hard to come by, if you'd seen any trends, kind of a breakdown among the casualty lists of anti-personnel mine victims versus sort of remnants of war and, the IEDs that we're seeing a lot of the groups use.
Yeah. The only one that I can pull out of the memory bank right now is explosive remnants of war. Children make up the majority of ERW casualties within the country. About 2/3 of the explosive remnants of war casualties are children. The rest of that breakdown I have, and I can give it to you at a later time because we've got a WhatsApp connection and I can do that. So fire that over to me and I will look at the Excel sheet and get more data on that for you.
Thank you.
More questions? Charles, do we have anything coming in online?
Sorry, while we wait for any other questions. My name is Jan Erik Støa, and I'm the country director for MPA in Thailand. Recently arrived in Thailand. So I thought I'd say a few words about Thailand, and then I have a question to Catherine. Unfortunately, the Director General of TMAC, or the Thailand Mine Action Center, could not participate today. The DG was supposed to come, but he had some urgent other business this morning, so he couldn't come. In terms of the contamination in Thailand, I would just like to add on to what was said in the presentation, that the last part to achieve compliance to the Mine Ban Treaty is probably the hardest part. Why? Because it's the most difficult terrain, It's the area where there is almost no information, and it's close and very much linked to the Cambodia situation and the demarcation of the border. So even if we make some simple calculations, MPA do not think that Thailand would be able to comply with the obligations by 2026. We think that Thailand will most probably ask for an extension sometime next year. It's not up to MPA to make any official statements or comments. The decision on that will be made by the Thailand authorities. But from an operator's point of view, and we are the only international operator in Thailand, and we have been here for 15 years. So from our point of view, we hope to advocate for an update of the survey along the border to make sure that we have captured all potential hazardous areas. And we also hope that the international community will contribute more to support Thailand's effort to fulfill the obligations. Currently, MPA has funding from Norway, Germany, and the US through the US Department of Defense, but that is a fraction of the funding provided to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And I spent my past 12 years in these three countries. Yeah, I think there is a lot of goodwill and good drive in Thailand to achieve the Mine Ban Treaty obligations. One question to you, Catherine, is can you say a few words about the situation about developing a long-term risk management strategy when Thailand is becoming or moving closer to completion? I know that you worked a lot with TMAC, so maybe you could say a few words about that positive development. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan Erik. Yes, I can certainly do that because I believe it's of particular interest as we are in Thailand. So part of the obligation of a country to complete clearance is also to have a residual capacity in the country to deal with everything that's potentially left. Everything that's potentially left, that can be other explosive remnants than war, other explosive remnants of war, others than the mines, but it can also be that in the future previously unknown minefield will be found and have to be cleared. So therefore, once a country completes its clearance, it still needs to have the capacity to deal with such situations. It still needs to have a system in place to support victims. It still needs to have the capacity to provide risk education when needed. And Thailand is currently quite advanced in the planning for that stage. So Thailand is discussing what mechanisms are we going to have in place. Is it going to be the same stakeholders? One of the important questions, as an example, is, are we going to have a national hotline? So if someone finds an explosive item, where can people report this item? Is it going to be through the police? Is it going to be through another body? These are all very important questions that need to be discussed and clarified before a country actually completes clearance. And that's why Thailand, although potentially asking for an extension request, is already planning that and is thinking about that. These are mechanisms. To set them up, it takes years, because you may have to change structures, you may have to build up new capacities, you need to make sure that all the data you gathered is going to be taken over in this new phase. And Thailand, I can say, is at a quite advanced stage. So it has a draft transition plan to residual contamination management. So ideas are there, how it could work. And the next few years will certainly be dedicated to further discuss this plan and hopefully take the decisions on the government level that this can be implemented.
We have one question coming in offline. Tamar, can you give that?
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. We have a question from Gaspar Ruiz Canela from the Spanish news agency EFE, asking if you can comment further on the situation in Ukraine this year from both the Russian army and the Ukrainian armed forces. A second question is, what is your reaction about President Biden's order to authorize the transfer of antipersonnel mines in Ukraine that was in the news today?
Mark, I think that's for you.
Yeah, thanks, Yeshua, and thanks for the online question. Last night, Washington time, sorry, I'm just here and my concept of today, tomorrow, and whatever is a little messed up. The Washington Post exclusively reported yesterday that President Joe Biden has authorized the provision of anti-personnel mine to Ukraine, according to 2 unnamed U.S. officials. That's it. I have no more details. Supposedly, again, the decision is going to be announced tomorrow or today here. I'm not sure. It's shocking. That's the only word. And going into a conference that recognizes 25 years of achievement in clearing mines, assisting victims, and destroying stockpiles. I don't really understand how that squares. And again, it's another one of those indicators that more mines appear to be going into the ground than coming out of the ground. And that trend needs to be reversed. It's going to be interesting to hear what the Ukrainians have to say about this. I'd like to wait to hear the official announcement before commenting more. On the other one, the use of anti-personnel mines, and to some degree has been probably the largest we've seen since the 90s. In the extent of Russian use, it's hard to document or survey it because the Russians have control of the territory, and I would probably not be very welcome there asking the questions. We're seeing some innovations. The Russians are now dropping anti-personnel mines from drones randomly. We know that. We know the number of victims, as Lauren has addressed, only indicates the severity of the problem. And now you're going to add to it with yet another weapon system that has the reputation for not being a very effective weapon. I'll leave, and the last point about allegations or research that we presented last year at this time about Ukrainian use of anti-personnel mines. They promised to investigate it, to uphold their obligations, and to be a member in good standing of the international community on this issue. Yet to see what this announcement from the Biden administration, whether it's assisting, encouraging, or inducing the use of this weapon. Russia was roundly criticized by the international community about using this weapon, but Russia has taken an increasingly negative attitude. Every year there's a vote at the UN General Assembly about certain resolutions, and one of them is on the implementation and universalization of this treaty. Since this vote began in 1999, no country ever voted no. Sure, there were 20 or so countries that abstained, said nice words about the humanitarian impact, and made their excuses for the military utility. But slowly and incrementally, we were moving countries. One of the steps was to vote yes or not to abstain. Last year, Russia became the only country so far to vote no for that. And they continually deride efforts to eliminate the suffering caused by the weapons, they have produced new landmines. We saw them with production markings in the 2020s used in Ukraine. So Russia has been a major cause of that balance shifting, which is very disturbing. And with that, hopefully, I'm done.
Thank you, Mark. I'd also like to point out that Ukraine, as a state party to the Mine Ban Treaty, cannot accept those mines. You know, we're going to end up seeing what happens. The situation is unfolding. Next question, please.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Sudatich, and I worked in the mine action sector in Myanmar for a number of years. I have two questions relating to funding for humanitarian mine action. The first is looking at the kind of figure that you presented earlier, less than 1% going to national nonprofit organizations. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on that, and how can the mine action sector be further localized, especially considering the recent news that Myanmar has surpassed Syria in terms of landmine casualties and the difficulties that many international actors face in kind of gaining access to contaminated areas and communities that are affected by landmines and unexploded ordnance in general. And the second question is, what do you think will be the impact of Trump's second term on funding for humanitarian mine action? Whether you have any thoughts to share, and what the impact was on the first term. Do you think it will be more drastic this time around? Thank you.
Ruth, those are for you, including the prophecy.
Including what?
The prophecy.
I'm going to pass that one to. Thank you. Yeah. I think sort of the first thing to say is that not all funding is disaggregated in terms of who it goes to. So the figures that I've presented are very much based on what is disaggregated in terms of what's going to the UN, what's going to international non-profits, and what's going to local non-profits. So I do know that there is some funding going to some local organizations, for example, in Afghanistan, from the US, but they haven't disaggregated it. But of course, the funding for Afghanistan has gone down, so presumably the funding to those national demining agencies has gone down as well. I think that it's kind of really important that we do look at this, because obviously we found during COVID that you know, it was the local organizations that did have more access to different areas and were able to keep for example, providing risk education messages, and also providing services to victims. And I think also that local organisations have a role to play with residual risk management as well, as Katrin was talking about. For example, in Cambodia, which is the country that I know best, you know, there has been quite a lot of work to support local networks and local organisations for reporting of mines and ERW, and also for victim assistance services. So I think we need to I think there needs to be better reporting. We have international NGOs that also support national NGOs, but you know, they kind of, the money goes directly to them, so it's very difficult to know how the money is going to the local organisations, and also how those local organisations are being, how their capacity is being built perhaps to be able to get money directly in the future. And obviously for a lot of international donors, they're much more happy to provide funding to international organisations who, rightly or wrongly, they feel maybe are more accountable or more easily accountable than local organisations. So I hope that's helped to answer that one. I think I have to hand it over to Mark, because he probably has a much better idea about Trump than I do, but I would imagine it's not good news in terms of funding from the US. I don't think it's going to be a priority. I don't know, Mark, do you have anything else to add to that?
I don't have anything to add, because they have not addressed it. You know, there's talk of cutting foreign aid across the board in the US right now. The Trump administration, the executive, the legislative, and the Supreme Court is now all under Republican control. And the budget situation, because it's been operating under a continuing resolution, Trump will be able to dictate the terms of this year's fiscal because of the continuing resolution. I don't know, I haven't received any indicators that the demining funding stream is going to go anywhere yet. It's just one of those things with this administration that's too unknown to know. But the trend is they're going to cut funding for just about everything, including our non-existent health care, and any...
Is it through Department of Defense or USAID?
The demining funding is done through the State Department and in an office called the Office of Weapons Abatement.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? David.
Yeah. I have a question, but I first wanted to address the question that came up. The U.S. is going to cut foreign aid across the board. The good news in relation to mine clearance and those things is I spent a lot of time in Congress with former Senator Leahy, and you had people come together on mine action that couldn't be in the same room together on anything else. There's also a very strong constituency among Christian groups, evangelical Christian groups, that are big supporters of Trump. So, you know, I would begin to look particularly pious and go out and see if you can get those on board. But on the issue of landmines, you find people that you wouldn't expect to be helpful, to be extremely helpful. Two other things I just wanted to say. In relation to what's now called risk education, used to be mine education, I remember when I was in Mozambique that they had this extremely effective education program which did it in layers from basically mobilization of the whole country. They had a song that was so catchy that when I was editing my film, nobody who worked on it could get it out of their head, down to then very specific sort of things for kids in mine-affected area. And finally, getting to my question, which is technical, is I would like to hear more about why it's difficult to destroy butterfly mines, because there are an awful lot of those butterfly mines around.
Anyone want to handle that?
Butterfly mines?
What? Go ahead.
What's your...
No,
With the butterfly mines?
no, I'm joking.
No.
The PFM mine, the Russian mine, kind of looks like a seed pod when it comes down and it flutters. The Soviets, when they copied it from the U.S., used a different explosive. They used a liquid explosive that, when burned, will create toxic off-gassing. And any of the assistance programs that was provided to Ukraine required the Ukrainians to uphold EU contamination standards, European standards for emissions. So that took about 7 years to resolve. So it's the novel explosive inside of it requires incineration and effluent handling to get rid of that toxic materials out of it. And there's 3.3 million of them.
Okay, I see no more questions here. Do we have any more questions online? No, we don't. Okay, in that way, I'm going to bring the press conference to a close. I'd like to thank you all for coming. For our journalists here, Charles, raise your hand here. He is our media czar, and he can arrange interviews with you with different resource people that we have available for journalists. And I'd like to give a shout out to Alea, who has helped bring our Landmine Monitor to completion. And with that, I bid you all a very good day.
I was trying to work out, how does this system work? Is someone switching?
Yeah, I think someone's controlling.